Hello and welcome to New Breakpoint, Microsoft's digital event series designed for developers by developers. I am your host, Michelle Sanford, the Developer Engagement Lead for Australia, New Zealand and Asia. We broadcast on the second Thursday of every month, and if you join us on the day, my guests and I will answer your questions live in chat. As you might know, New Breakpoint has expanded to encompass Asia Pacific, meaning we're now bringing interviews with developer experts from all over Asia. And today we are welcoming Scott Holden, who is the Developer Solution Engineering Team Lead in Australia and New Zealand. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here today and to show off hopefully some pretty cool technology.
And is that the right title that I've given you there?
Yes, absolutely right. So I'm leading up the software solution engineering team locally in Australia and New Zealand, but I actually come from a background of being a global black belt, so working all across Asia. So I can hopefully share some insights around that as well today.
Or maybe you could just quickly, because a lot of people
Yeah,
don't work for Microsoft and they don't know, what is the
gotcha.
difference between a global black belt and a solution engineer?
Yeah, great question. And when we look at solution engineer, it's really working in technical pre-sales directly alongside customers, driving customer value, solving problems, if you will. Whereas the global black belt team takes that slightly more strategic view of the world, looking at how can we create repeatable IP and working across geographies to see what customer trends exist between Asia, Australia, and globally. So it's really great to have both those two sides of the coin to be able to look at what's happening across Asia, as well as what's happening locally within Australia and New Zealand.
I think they're both really cool job titles, but I always imagined like the black belts as sort of like, you know, fighting their way through the code.
Absolutely. It's one of those fun things where it's like, it's a great title to have, but at the same time, I don't like calling myself a black belt because I'm certainly not that coordinated in real life.
Well, I think the next stage is some sort of like developer superhero, and then you
Absolutely.
you you fly. That's next.
That's it.
Cool.
All
So
right.
today we are going to talk about GitHub Copilot in the CLI. And I
Yes,
know this is
yes.
something that people have been waiting for a while, and now it is out there in earnest. It's GA, right? Everyone can use that.
So currently in public preview, everyone can now
Mm.
use it and install it, and we'll walk through the steps of how to actually get started with it, how to log in, how to install, that sort of thing. But it is public preview today.
Oh, excellent. It's very hard to keep up because
Oh,
everything is being released in GitHub Copilot so fast. The number of
yeah.
models that you see today is such a huge list compared to how it was at the start.
Absolutely, and it's funny every time I talk about, especially GitHub Copilot CLI, I always do a quick update before we kick off, and I'm like, oh, we've just jumped 3 or 4 versions. I better check what's in those versions as well. So it's a technology that is constantly evolving, and that's what makes it quite exciting.
And why might people use GitHub Copilot in the CLI as opposed to, well, what are our options
Oh,
around there?
great question. And I kind of break it down into three different experiences. There's in the CLI, there's in the IDE or your development environment, and then there's inside of GitHub as part of the coding agents. And we can very much think of the IDE, so like Visual Studio Code or Eclipse or Visual Studio is where we'd natively do development. So it makes sense to have GitHub Copilot in that experience. But if we're looking at things like maybe automation and shell script development, maybe we're logged onto a server that we want to be able to use GitHub Copilot to help debug and diagnose or make changes on the fly. It makes it a lot easier to have it in the terminal rather than constantly having to install a graphical interface and an IDE just to spin it up to begin using these agents. I personally, outside of work, do a lot of embedded firmware development, and I found it's really nice to be able to SSH across to a device and use GitHub Copilot there natively on the device itself, rather than having to worry about building tunnels backwards and forwards. So it is really about allowing you to use it anywhere you see fit, whether it's in the browser, in the IDE, or from the terminal. And it really completes that end-to-end landscape of just using GitHub Copilot where you are.
Mm. And do you think that you Do you think that this is exciting to you because of your background in DevOps?
Absolutely. To me, and we'll dive into it a little bit in the demo, but there's kind of a special flag that you can pass into the CLI to say, rather than having a conversation and being interactive, we can actually call it in a programmatic manner. So we can actually use it as a CLI tool in the same way we would, well, traditional CLI tools. So all of a sudden, it's no longer just something that a human can interact with. We can now begin to wrap scripts around it, or run automation on top of it, even have it as part of things like our pipelines or GitHub Actions. So all of a sudden, it doesn't just have to be a human kicking off a conversation with GitHub Copilot. We can instead now use automation to trigger conversations with GitHub Copilot. And the best one I like there is things like security reviews, where it might be the same prompt that we're using over and over again. I don't want to have to remember to run that every time. So let's set up some automation through GitHub Copilot CLI.
I think it has made me a lot calmer about all the stuff that I do, because in the past, not being able to remember all the commands and having to look up documentation or look up specific syntax or
Yeah.
commands, or even when it would tell you in the documentation, this is the command that you need to run
You're on.
with these
Yep.
options, I would still be like, yes, but what does that mean with
Mean.
those
Yep.
options? Which of those ones do I pick, and what is exactly is it looking for as those qualifiers? Whereas now I can just ask it and it will tell me, or I can say what I want it to do in natural language. And
Absolutely.
lazier, but also I think it explains stuff to me all the time. So it's
Oh,
constantly forcing me to learn and not letting me be lazy.
absolutely. I think there's something to be said there about reducing cognitive load. You'll have an idea of the outcome you want to achieve, but remembering the exact command line parameters every single time, being able to strip that away and instead use Copilot to help just makes life a lot easier. So, absolutely agree with you, and a great use case there. The other one that I, funnily enough, found myself using it for quite a bit, when you're downloading tools, everyone likes to say, hey, here's a shell script that you should run to install this tool. And it's like, well, what's this script actually doing?
Mm.
I found myself erring more on the side of saying, hey, GitHub Copilot, can you explain what this shell script is doing for me and run through what it actually does behind the scenes? I'm more likely to do that as a one-off than sit there reading a potential 1,000-line shell script trying to understand whether it does something good or bad. So reducing that load and how much information we need to parse is kind of key to modern development.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been working on something all this week actually, and I just feel I'm learning so much in those conversations we have with each other. So
Yep.
there's definitely stuff that I don't like when
Yep.
I'm building an app. Like I'm not a fan of the infrastructure side at all. I just want to be in the code. But obviously you can't build an app without infrastructure.
Yep.
And so we're doing that together. But then I'm much more likely to, like in the past, I would be in such a hurry to just write the code part of the app and get that going that I
Yep.
would skip lots of things that are important. Whereas now, as you say, we're talking about security, we're talking about testing,
Yep.
talking about what other things can I put in place to make sure that what I'm building is a trustworthy app.
Yep.
And it's I'm not frustrated. I'm delighted by it because of that.
Absolutely. I will give one very big tip or trick with that is I've actually found that building prompt files and agent files to describe the parts I like the least is actually a really powerful pattern.
Mm.
Whereas I know I like, especially some of the reformatting or like refactoring of infrastructure as code. It's a chore, and yes, I know I should do it, but it's really quite painful. But I'm quite particular about how I do that sort of thing. Actually having those kind of painful tasks written as prompts that I have tested and know work and become easily reusable means that I can actually not necessarily be lazy. It's not as if I'm not doing the work, but instead be a little bit smarter on those tasks that I might not enjoy. So it's funny. I recommend everyone the tasks that you hate doing, build a prompt for. Don't just do it once, save it off to the side, because
Mm.
it's great if you need to do that same thing like a security scan every time you make a change. Having it as a single click is really easy.
It's funny you're saying that, but
Yeah.
I was doing that today. So I'm literally have a file open in front of me
Yeah.
there called prompt_strategy.md.
Perfect. Brilliant.
Because yeah, the app that I built was too simple,
Yep.
and I wanted to have it do something a little bit more dynamic, and I wanted a flexibility around those prompts, so it
Yep.
wasn't just using this very basic thing. And yeah,
Perfect.
it's very, very interesting stuff. But I think I'm probably distracting from the CLI part of the conversation.
That's all right.
Why
Yeah.
why don't you
I was about to say,
tell
I'm
us?
going to share my screen. Let's dive into a terminal,
Yeah,
actually see what these tools look like hands-on, and also talk about some of the differences between the GitHub Copilot CLI and what you might have in GitHub Copilot in Visual Studio Code.
yes, perfect.
All right.
I'm using code spaces most of the time. I should say that is
Perfect.
my preferred one. The only time I don't use it is when I am on the plane, because as I like to say, the weird thing about the cloud is the only place you can't use it is in the clouds.
Yes. Awesome. Okay, so just checking, is that coming through? It should be a full screen terminal.
Yes.
There. Awesome. So the best place to start when we're talking about the CLI is in the CLI itself. And I've got an SSH session here set up on my local laptop, just using Windows Subsystem for Linux. This is the nice thing, is that I can just use it inside of any distribution that I want. To get started, and we won't run the full command because it takes a couple of minutes, we actually just do an npm install. So GitHub Copilot CLI is distributed as an npm package, which means you can use npm to install, to keep it up to date. There are some requirements around node version, recommended as node version 22. So if you have NVM, bump up your node version before you begin, but running install Copilot will actually get Copilot up and running for you. My favorite part is, because it's called Copilot, guess what? It is literally Copilot. So we type in Copilot to actually get into the CLI itself, and I've actually selected the wrong folder here. So let's change across to my live demo folder and run Copilot again. The first thing that actually pops up is quite important, asking us, do we trust this folder? Do we actually want to begin working in this folder? And to me, this is one of the big things that really sets GitHub Copilot apart from just using an LLM directly with a CLI. There are built-in security checks along the way to make sure it's operating in folders that you want, that it doesn't have too much access on your system, and that it's not making changes you don't expect. So I'm going to say, yes, I'm happy with it having access to the live demo folder, and we're up and running. So this is the entire user experience. It's quite nice. It's a very straightforward interface. To begin with, the place I like to start is with /commands, because that's normally where you'll want to interact with some of the settings inside of GitHub Copilot CLI. So we were saying before, there are quite a few different models available. You can actually use /model to change between the different models that work within GitHub Copilot CLI. Now, I will call out that there's only a few models in the CLI today. More will be coming available shortly down the track. But for the moment, we'll just be using Claude Sonnet 4.5.
Those are the most popular ones that people use for
Absolutely.
coding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the nice thing here is, because these are the same models you'll see inside of VS Code, if you have a preference for a model in VS Code, you can use that same preference over here, and vice versa. Now that we're here, we can actually do whatever we want. And I thought, let's start by doing something a little bit big. Let's actually ask it to create an entire project for us. Let's get it to create a to-do app with the ability to list, get, create, complete, basically the sort of getting started project that would want. Similar sort of experience to what you do in VS Code. When we press enter, it's going to automatically kick off in agent mode. This is one of the big things about GitHub Copilot CLI, is that it automatically runs in agent mode, and we'll go through and start thinking about what it needs to do. The next part is probably the important part. It hasn't just started running commands and changing things on our file system. It's actually prompting us step by step. And we can see here that it wants to run npm to install Express to get started. And I can either say yes, allow it once, yes, and allow it to run multiple times if it needs to install other dependencies, or no, and tell it what I want it to do differently. And this is really key because you may not be saying no because you don't want it to run npm install, but you may actually want it to run a different package or a different dependency, or maybe retrieve something from a private package library rather than the public one. In this case, I'm going to let it very happily go along and run npm install. It'll probably come back in a second and say, hey, I want you to run npm init for me. Give it a couple of seconds. Yep, there we go, npm init, so I can begin building the project and thinking. One of the nice things here is it is just working within the context that we have here inside the live demo folder, which is quite nice. As we're seeing the CLI commands be pasted one by one, we can modify them if we need. This is the second part, in that even though it might have read access to files, it doesn't actually have write access unless we give it access to. So here I'm going to say, yes, I'm happy for you to begin writing and changing all of these. Perfect. And it's going to very happily now write those changes to disk and come back with a message saying it's done. So it's basically the same experience that you have inside of agent mode, inside of VS Code, but via this command line interface, which is quite nice.
Where you're speaking about agent mode,
yes.
I do always like to stress to people before we go much further that I don't think agent mode is for everyone. I think agent mode is for if you are a senior dev or architect and you have that architecture in your mind, you know what you want to do, and you're able to quite definitively tell it what you want, then agent mode is going to help you go faster and help you get through loads of stuff really quickly. But if you are early in career or a beginner developer, I don't think you should use it. I think you should use ask mode only, because then it will teach you and you will learn, and it won't be skipping over things that if you can't explain how it has built it, then you can't really be a true developer in your career.
100%. And I've actually seen some great prompt files, and we'll talk about prompt files in a moment, that begin to change agent mode slightly to, rather than just trying to do everything all at once, actually break it down to build to-do lists and tasks. And this is where we head more towards the spec-driven development, where we're explicitly defining and building behavior before then creating the code. Because you're 100% right. If I give it a very generic open-ended task, there's a million different rabbit holes it could go down and try and execute. You need to be pretty keyed in as to the instructions you give, which is great for senior devs who know the architecture that they want to do. But for junior devs who might not know, you're absolutely right. It can be a little bit of a foot gun.
Yeah, and I just think if you're tired as well, it's pretty easy to turn your brain off and just be saying yes, go ahead, do it. And then you end up like, even 20 minutes later, wait a minute, what's happened here? Have we gone? What have we done? And unpicking that and going backwards to try and figure out where you went off your path. It's very easy to do. So it's a powerful tool, but also you need to be paying attention and you need to know what you're doing to use agent mode, I think.
Absolutely. And there's two extra parts that I'll actually drop on top of that, and we can run through them as demos. The first one is we can still use it in that more ask style mode rather than do style mode. So I can actually jump in here and say, let's do explain what, and cool neat feature here, if I do the @ symbol, it'll actually give me the ability to select a file via a dropdown, so I don't need to remember what's on the file system. Explain what server.js does. And it's going to go off and do that traditional, hey, answer the question without making changes to code, which is great because it gives us that explanation. The nice thing here is because I've said explicitly @ server.js, it's going to know what context I'm talking about. So it's going to be a little bit more targeted than a generic, hey, explain this project overall. So we'll give it a couple of seconds to come back. It's always the fun of live demos.
I notice it says that it's thinking. And I remember when we were first talking about AI, there was always that caveat that most
Yeah.
people would make saying, don't anthropomorphize your AI. It's
Yeah.
not really thinking. It's
Yeah.
not like a human. And I did philosophy for my undergraduate degree. So in fact, I enjoy anthropomorphizing it. What's your take on that? Is it
It's an
thinking?
it's an interesting one because I think the single hit call to an LLM doesn't really feel like thinking because it's just a single step of inference. Where I think we get closer towards that world of thinking is actually doing reasoning and step by step. Because in reality, a thought process isn't like a single thing and boom, we're done. It's stepping through things, taking inputs from our environment around us. So, yeah, it's funny. I'm not sure thinking is the best word in the world, but the whole idea of it actually saying, hey, I'm not just going to do one thing, but I'm going to take this step by step and maybe look at some files or look up some documentation. So
I find it reassuring when
yeah.
I can see that it's checking like multiple files.
Yeah.
I really like that.
Absolutely. So we can see here that it's explained what it is, what's in this repository, which is absolutely fantastic. But I've realized I've made a lot of changes here and I haven't checked this into source control because ideally, especially when we're working in agent mode, we should be thinking about our branching strategy, how we actually split our changes up, break them into smaller components, and either have the agent help us with commits and commit messages or take control of them ourselves. I'm a big fan of like, you drive the source control when things are merged, how things are broken up, if the agent wants to do the work. So inside of the Copilot CLI, we can actually use the exclamation mark to run a CLI command. So I can actually just jump in here and say git init. And I've now called git from inside the Copilot CLI. The best thing is those commands don't call the model. They don't leave your machine. It's nice and local. So you don't have to constantly be switching between tools to be running commands on top of this. So I could jump in here and now begin to do a git checkout -b and maybe call this test. And I'm now on a branch to begin working on the next step of what I'd like to do for this project. Cool. So that kind of gives us a bit of an introduction to the GitHub Copilot CLI. I wanted to dive a bit deeper into some of the ways we can actually change and modify the CLI, because this is where I feel we go from, okay, this is just a really cool CLI experience to something that can actually be useful. And the one we were talking about before is prompt files. So you know what I am. Let's actually set up a .github folder so we can begin to store files relevant to GitHub. And you know what? Let's actually build a prompt file. And I'm going to say all explanation should be in both English and Spanish, because I want to make sure that users from either of these languages can read through and understand explanations. So let's place that into our Copilot instructions. And the nice thing here is it's the same. I placed that into completely the wrong place. So let's put that into the GitHub folder. That's better. This Copilot instructions file, which is just a markdown file, is actually the same one we use in VS Code as well as the CLI. The nice thing here is it means if we have these instructions set once, we can reference them anywhere. So if I actually jump back into Copilot, give this a couple of seconds and say the same thing of explain at server.js, exactly the same thing that we said previously. We'll note that it's not just going to come back with an explanation, but it's also going to include those Copilot instructions without me having to specify it. Now, nice little example of two languages there. But you can imagine if you have corporate acronyms, if you have terms that are only used internally in your organization, or maybe particular coding styles that you'd like to use everywhere, having them in Copilot instructions can be super powerful. Best part is you don't need to remember to include them every time. It's just automatically done for you.
I do have in my Copilot instructions, the first line is that it needs to address me as Master Chief Sparkle.
I love that. Oh, check that into every single repo.
It's just that as soon as it says, well, Master Chief Sparkle, you should do this, it immediately cheers me up.
That's
And so
brilliant.
even if I'm struggling with something, it's just a little brightness in my day. But the other thing I
Absolutely.
have in there is that I want it to always keep my code clean and simple.
Yes. Yep.
And I know that all of these fancy models, like more and more often, they want to offer you like more and they want
More.
to like
Yep.
put more features in, they want to do more stuff and it's bigger and even the explanations are bigger.
Yep.
And I don't want that. I just want them to keep it simple. And
Simple.
so I put that in my Copilot instructions as well.
Brilliant. And that's a great example of like that user personalization, because I absolutely agree. Sometimes you end up with code that's like, oh, okay, this is very much enterprise code with 1,000,001 dials and whistles. So being able to simplify is great.
Yeah, it
Cool.
doesn't take much for it to want to leap into enterprise code.
Yes. But the nice thing about the CLI is we can not only just extend it through like Copilot instructions and agent files, we can actually use MCPs with it as well. So Model Context Protocol servers give us the ability to call external tools. And there's a couple that are built into the GitHub CLI, the ability to talk across to GitHub and create GitHub issues. But I thought, let's actually set up a link to a publicly available MCP server. So I don't have to configure anything locally on my machine or set anything up, but I can extend the power of GitHub Copilot really quickly. So if I jump in here and do /MCP, we can actually begin to add and remove our MCP servers. And I'm going to just quickly delete the one that I created earlier and jump back in. And we can now add in the MCP server that we'd like to add. So I'll just press A to add in, and it'll come up with a small interface saying, hey, give this a name. I'm actually going to call this MS Learn. MS Learn, or the Microsoft documentation, actually has a full public MCP server. So you can add it as an MCP server into Visual Studio Code, into Copilot CLI, and reference all of the documentation on Microsoft Learn, which is really nice. One fun fact here, if you run into bugs, add this on and use it as another troubleshooting step. It's really nice to actually use the documentation and have references to those docs, not just an answer generated by an LLM. We're going to jump. Yeah.
When you're referencing all these MCP servers, is
Yes.
it like using a lot of tokens or anything like that?
So this is a very interesting question, and you know, watchers have probably seen things like Anthropic's new skills and the whole conversation of what is a tool and how do we actually describe it. It all comes down to the end of the day to context, how much information we're sending to the LLM for it to make a decision. And you can imagine for each tool that we add in, it's going to need a description. It's going to need some information about how the tool should be used. So any request formatting and that sort of thing. So if we have a couple of tools, it doesn't really change the context that much. The majority of the context is still going to be your code that's being sent up. But if you have hundreds or thousands of tools, you can end up very quickly with more tools than actual code context, leading to a scenario where it does not only slow down, but you're including all of these tools that may not be useful at all. So I'm always recommend, especially when we look at both tools and MCPs, pick the smallest number that would be usable for a given task. It'll make things quicker, makes it easier to identify where it's calling it or not and why it may be doing that. There is something to be said about things like documentation, having it always available as something to turn on and off on demand, rather than having to set it up every time.
Right, so you want to pick your favorite one, like yours being MS
100%.
Learn, as opposed to picking 5 or 6 from like one from
Correct.
every provider. You don't want to do that.
That's it. And one of the nice things, especially with both and my terminal, is having great fun here. So I'm just going to manually type in the learn URL. That's all right. One of the nice things about both GitHub Copilot CLI and Visual Studio Code is a lot of the times you can actually add it to your configuration, but then stop it or turn it off, meaning that you still have the config there. So it is just an enable or disable flag that you use, but you can still build up that library. Just turn them on and off as you need them. So
I did notice that the other day, that there was a drop down list with all of them there, and you could just tick them or untick them.
Tick them up. Absolutely. And we're getting to the world of where we're actually beginning to see Copilot-like experiences, pick and choose what tools should be enabled, disable tools, that sort of thing. It's a quite interesting mental exercise to think, if you were given 1,000 different tools laid out on a bench and said, hey, can you solve this problem? Just looking through all those tools to decide which one to use would take you a fair bit of time. Whereas if you go to the toolbox and you open up the tool drawer that says screwdrivers, that's at least a little bit more context about what tool you might choose to use. So, all right, we've got our MCP server set up. So if I jump back in and do /MCP, we can actually see it set up there, MS-learn pointed towards the public MCP. And I can begin to ask questions now that will be answered using MS-learn. So I can do things like, let's do, is the version of Node I'm using supported on Azure App Service? Because this is a really interesting question where you might be logged into a legacy server that has a copy of code on it that you really want to modernize, but you haven't actually dug into it. This sort of thing is really powerful. So I'll say, yep, happy for it to run Node version to find out what version it is. We can see that there's a Microsoft Docs support there. It's going to go through. One thing that's really interesting here is inside of our docs, we actually list, hey, to check what runtimes are available, use AZ web app list runtimes. So it's actually discovered through our documentation what CLI commands it should run to actually discover this information. Now, I'm happy with not getting an up-to-date list and just using the list that's in the documentation. So I'm going to say no and give it a couple of seconds to process and think about it. Hopefully it's going to be good. Let's give it a kick off again. I think the reject there. Here we go. Oh, sorry. I stopped the entire task rather than saying, yes, that's fine. Perfect. Here we go. I'm using version 22, which is not explicitly listed in there, but it does list 14, 16, 18, and 20. So this is great because it's checked, hey, what version do I have locally? What versions are listed in the documentation? What should I use? In this case, it's recommending I use Node 20, the long-term support that's currently deployed, or it's actually giving me an alternative of how to host this with the same Node version I have. And the best thing here is that as the documentation's updated and changed, I don't need to wait for a new model to be released. It can research the documentation and find out when things, well, if say, for example, that changes tomorrow and the docs are updated, running the same command will actually give me the answer from the updated docs. So an incredibly exciting way to think about how we can reference external tools and add context beyond just what we have locally. And I will add one tiny thing in here that I'm seeing this be such a major game changer in modernization. If you have an old legacy server, an old legacy application deployed somewhere, throwing the CLI on there, getting the agent to explore the code that's there, to find the dependencies, to look for what is actually installed on that server, saves so much time. But then being able to pair that up with the MS documentation to say, hey, and how should we modernize this? What are the considerations to bring it across? Super cool and very powerful.
Yeah, I definitely love that. Love that part. Dependencies is certainly something I've had a lot of trouble with in the past. And that's one of the reasons I jumped to using code spaces more often, because it often keeps my code cleaner and in the right version. But yeah, just being able to ask Copilot to check it for me and see whether anything needs adjusting and updating or whatever is, marvelous.
Perfect. I think we've got time for one more quick demo because I want to show how we can automate some of these things. So if I actually jump out of the Copilot CLI and go back to my normal terminal interface and go Copilot --help, you can actually see that there's more flags here than just launching the interactive experience. We can actually go so far as to even pass prompts through on the command line. So I can jump in here and say, hey, Copilot, I think I might go to one I created earlier. I should have, there we go. Do I still have it on the, I do, I still have it on the terminal. Create a test.http file with HTTP requests for all the operations. This is a great example of where I'm generating documentation for an existing project without necessarily having to parse through the project myself. And we can see here that it's reading server.js and it's going ahead to create the file with that information. And something very important happened here. Permission denied. So you remember before when we had that interactive experience of saying, hey, do we want to allow this tool? Do we want to deny this tool? In the case of Copilot CLI, when we're passing through as CLI parameters, it will automatically disable all tools, and especially tools that can have write changes to it. So in this case, it's trying its hardest to see, hey, is this a permissions issue? Do I not have access? In this case, I just haven't given it the ability to write. So the nice thing here is I can actually jump in and say, all right, I'm going to give it permission to write to the file system, not just read. So I can do a -- allow tools and give it access to the write tool, which allows to write back to the file system. If I run that again, I've now given allow tool, not allow tools. There we go. I've now given it permission to write to disk. And to me, this was the big selling feature for programmatic access, is that the default mode can't write, can't execute CLI commands that are destructive, and you end up with a really nice able to read and parse experience that you then have to opt in writing. And I find that kind of refreshing in a world where, hey, we have these tools that make destructive changes by default or can delete databases without user interactions. Having something as simple as writing to a file system put behind a flag just makes me sleep a little bit better at night.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. So there's one other thing that I want to show on top of that, because this is where we wrap it all up together and be able to combine our Copilot instructions, our GitHub Copilot CLI, our programmatic access, and I can actually jump into, let's just do a quick review.sh, and I can, if I can remember how to drive Vim, I can actually give a quick shell script to say I would like to review Copilot-P, create a security review in Markdown of this repo. Save it as a script. Let's quickly make it so we can execute it and kick it off. We've now actually just taken our Copilot with our prompt, with read-only access to be able to just read files and not change them, plus our Copilot instructions, and wrapped it all up into a single script that I could run as part of a pipeline, that I could run locally as tooling, that I could use anywhere. And this is where, well, here we go. It's actually trying to do an NPM audit and get very smart, but it doesn't have access to do that. This is where all of a sudden Copilot CLI means no matter where we are, if I'm on my local machine, if I'm connected to a remote machine, if I'm working with a legacy application that doesn't have IDE support, I can still use that same Copilot experience. And that's what's most exciting to me, the whole idea of actually having GitHub Copilot everywhere, not just being bound to an IDE itself.
Yeah, I really like the options.
Oh,
so someone that wants to use it in the CLI can use it in the CLI. Someone wants to use it in the cloud can use it in the cloud. Someone wants to use it in Visual Studio or whatever. And it's how you want to use it, where you want to use it. Go ahead.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people were asking for the CLI before it came, so
Yeah.
happy
And
days.
absolutely. As I say, my favorite part is the fact that you can just do an npm install to get started, makes it very, very easy. But at the same time, it's not as if we're changing to a completely different experience where Copilot instructions aren't supported. It's the same experience across all of the platforms, which to me is one of the biggest things when it comes to being productive as a developer. I don't want to be learning a brand new tool for every single environment, for every single setup. Having one set of tools that I can use over and over again and actually get work done is, yeah, pretty important. Um, I didn't give it permission to actually create the security review. So in a couple of seconds, it's just going to print it out to the screen. But that's it for demos for me today. I hope it was insightful looking at the CLI and some of the things we can do with it. I think the big takeaway is, I'm going to say no to that. There we go. There's our conclusion in both Spanish and English, which is fantastic. The biggest takeaway here is that it is still just GitHub Copilot. It's the same models we use inside of VS Code, just a different way of interacting with it. And that, to me, is, yeah, just brilliant.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So we're going to put a few links in our GitHub log for where people can learn how to use GitHub Copilot
Absolutely.
and the CLI
Yeah.
and follow some learning paths if they want to learn more about GitHub Copilot. We're going to stay online for an extra 10 minutes
Questions?
or so
Yeah.
to do Q&A. Is there anything else that you want to give as your key takeaway for the episode?
Key takeaway is we need to start thinking about how we can make the tools work for us. And especially in the world of AI, we've really focused so much on, oh, yes, the AI will do the work. The AI will write the code for me. Actually taking a step back and thinking, how do I want to use these tools? How can I make them productive to me? Was to a degree the same way we thought of autocomplete, the same way we thought of visual IDEs, the same way we thought of previews and renders. I think we need to begin to shift our mindset to how do I make the tools make me more efficient rather than just, hey, these are cool tools. I guess I'll use them.
Yeah, I had someone say to me yesterday that she was against using AI on moral grounds. And I thought, do you know what? There's not much you can say to that,
No.
actually.
Yeah, it's yeah. I really think it's going to be interesting to see the industry over the next few years around I remember the transition from plain text editors to autocomplete and IntelliSense, and this whole idea of this is going to break developers because they will no longer remember the fields on a class, that sort of thing. Whereas I think we've found that, okay, it doesn't change the way we think about software engineering. Instead, it's a tool to help us be more efficient. So I do wonder, especially for those that sort of moral objection to the use of AI, I think, can we find a middle ground there in terms of where we can be using it as a tool for efficiency and not necessarily as something that's trying to solve the world in a single CLI?
Oh, do you know though, when she said that, I was thinking she meant like from a green software perspective.
Gotcha. Yep. Water use, yes.
Yeah, because we were definitely on track, especially Microsoft as a company. We
Yep.
were on track for carbon neutral by 2030, not just across Microsoft and GitHub, but across all our suppliers and supply chains.
Hmm.
I know that like the big push into Gen AI has been a huge surge
Mm.
in power and in resources and all of that. So it's going to require a lot of work from the whole world to focus on getting us back to that carbon neutral stance that we definitely agree is important. And so,
Absolutely.
and I think as well, I guess it's very easy to just keep asking it and asking it and asking it, keep pressing the
Yeah.
button, which is definitely burning through resources.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but in terms of is AI a great enabler? Is it a great teacher, a great productivity assistant? I think, yeah, it definitely has the potential to change the way that we work, and there are good ways to use it and bad ways to use it. And if you use it lazily, then you will not profit as an individual. Your career will not accelerate. But if you use it in good ways, in the right way, then it can make you so much better at what you do. And
Absolutely.
yeah, teach you and help you go faster. And there's different ways to use it depending on if you're a beginner or if you're advanced. But yes, don't give in and just think the machines are taking over. That's not at all how it works.
Absolutely.
I was going to say, it has been wonderful to have you on the episode today. We'll stick around and carry on answering questions for a little bit. And we look forward to seeing everyone again next month. So thank you, Scott, for joining us today.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me. I'll catch you all later.
We hope you enjoyed this digital event. We have specialists on standby to answer your questions for a short while. To ask a question, type it into the chat window now and we'll get to it as quickly as we can. If you're not staying for the Q&A, thank you for attending and we hope to see you again soon.